Okay, in our third video in class, we are going to be talking about inequality in the US in particular. So class and economic inequality today, something that's very prevalent during this pandemic. And the discussion of class and capitalist is going to be very central. So you may want to revisit that if it's been a hot minute. We'll see that the trends we see today are started in the 80s and have only increased, and we're going to ask why. So we can think of all the income and wealth in society as something like a pie. We take everybody's income, your paycheck, my paycheck, we put all that money in one pie, and then say, how do we as a society in the US divide it up? As we'll see, if it was equal, like on the right, 1/5 of society, we get 1/5 of the income. Makes sense. But the US, we don't do that. We are one of the most unequal societies in the world, and when we look at income and wealth, which are a little different, we'll see that it ain't like that. The bottom share of society for wealth, for example, is on the left here. The bottom 2/5 of society almost don't have any wealth at all. We'll look at what wealth is in a minute. So income is your paycheck. It's the money you make in a year, a month, etc. It's not your savings, it's not your car, that's something you own, but this is just your income. As we've seen since the 1980s, the top earners in our society have increasingly taken more and more of the pie. Right? So that top line is the top 1%, and they've seen their share of the income grow enormously. So is the top 5%, and hell, the top 20%. But those of us on the bottom 60% of society have seen our wages stagnate. That's interesting. So we see unequal growth and unequal distribution of income in our society. We'd also look at wealth. Wealth is the stock of assets that you own. For most of us, it might be a house. I'm actually looking into houses right now, or a car. But for those who have some financial equity, they might have stocks, bonds. You might have a savings account. There's basically anything you own that is not your income, right? That you're not dependent on a weekly basis. You take some of your paycheck, you put it in a savings account, and now you have wealth, not income. Right? So what we see is that through the 40s, 50s, 60s, the top 0.1%, the top 10th of 1%, only owned about 10% of the wealth in society. So that's still way more than their fair share, but what the heck. But since the 80s, again, we see this inequality growing so that, the top 10th of 1% of people in our society own almost a quarter of all the wealth. That's bonkers. Why is that? Well, there has been a series of projects and ideas that have been put into place since the 1980s by politicians and elites in power that have led to increasing inequality and increasing wealth and income in the hands of the best off in our society. So in that middle period in the 50s, we had what we call a progressive tax regime. Progressive means we take some money from the wealthiest in society and we put it into programs and things for the poorest in society. So at the top end here, we'd see it's actually that blue line in 1956 or something. It's almost at 90% of regular income for top earners. Now that might seem crazy, taking 90% of somebody's income, but if you're earning $15 million, then at a certain point, past that 15 million, 90% is pretty fair because 15 million, you add another 15 million on that, what are you going to do with the next 15 million? There's only so much you can spend your money on. I have a friend who's a millionaire, and I asked him, if we taxed you at 70% of your income, he has a house in Atlanta, a condo in Miami, he occasionally takes a helicopter to football games. He's that kind of money, and Miami's very expensive. And I said, if we taxed you at 70% of your wealth, and he's like, oh, it's my income. He talks like that. My hard work. I was like, would your lifestyle change if we did that? And he's like, well, no, it wouldn't. But it's not fair. It's my income. And that's what we've said since the 1970s. We've gone from saying the wealthy should give to the poorest in society to saying that everybody should just compete and work hard, and an individual earns their income. Now, if you think back to that Marxian model, we know that's not necessarily his view on it. That actually workers create the wealth of a lot of these folks. So since the 70s, we've had a regressive tax regime. And you and I are actually taxed more than the wealthiest 400 families in our society as a percentage of their income. So it's regressive. The wealthy aren't taxed more. At the same time, we've seen companies minimize through mergers and acquisitions, that is through buying other companies or merging with them. Think about how many options you have for buying internet and cable. Is it maybe a major concern for you right now? There's 3 options, and when you look at the packages they offer, they're almost exactly the same. So this means that more and more money is concentrated and centralized in fewer and fewer hands. More companies have more power. At the same time, we've seen unions decline. Unions are alliances of workers who band together and pool their funds to try to go up against businesses. Unions are the reasons that we have minimum wage hours, because workers fought for them. But union membership has declined since the 60s, in part because people passed laws that have hampered unions' ability to raise funds, called closed shop laws. They passed open shop laws because, which then ban unions from forcing people to pay dues. So unions can't fundraise, and in that way they can't really challenge and organize in ways to go against those big companies, which, as we saw in the last slide, are getting more and more powerful. Wages have stagnated. Real wages is simply a measure of how much does your income actually buy. You may get a $1 raise next year per hour, but if bread is $1 more, you're not really getting an increase in your real wages. You're just getting an increase with inflation or the changing value of money. Since the 60s and 70s in particular, wages have stagnated even though our productivity has not. This is pretty good for capitalists, but it kind of sucks for workers. To make up for that, though, we see this booming industry of credit, and consumer credit and debt. Again, this really spikes in the 70s as wages stagnate. There are whole companies that make money off of lending to us, putting us in credit. Because, hey, capitalists need us to keep buying stuff if their companies are going to do well. If we're not consuming more Netflix, if we're not buying more meat, then those companies go under. Capitalism is, for it to grow, depends on the constant churning of the market. They have to constantly make more stuff. We see this really clearly with COVID. When things stop, companies disappear. We're not out there buying, restaurants go away. They can only grow if we're constantly consuming. 4 businesses on my street have gone away. Small businesses have, but big businesses have also taken a hit because people aren't going out and consuming as much. This is why in times of crisis, they try to give people stimulus and incentives to go buy because they need it for the economy to keep churning. At the same time, companies have stopped offering fixed pension plans to retired workers. It used to be that if you worked for a company for 30 years, you retired, they would pay you some of your income. That's called a pension plan. But those have virtually gone away, as we see. Today, most of us will have a 401k, which is investment in the stock market. What that means is we are investing in those companies. So instead of paying us to retire and being stable, we're investing in stocks of companies and relying on that stock portfolio to feed us when we retire. Of course, if the market goes down, as it tends to do, then our retirement plan completely dries up. This is great for companies, but bad for workers. Companies have also relied a lot more on underemploying people. So flexible work is much more common now. For example, it used to be almost all faculty at a college would be tenured, but now most are actually adjunct, or you see it as staff. Adjuncts are paid by the class or sometimes by the student in that class. And if we don't have enough students for that class next semester, we don't hire them, we don't pay them. Right? Great for the college, we don't have to deal with that worker, but it's really bad for the teacher. If you work in retail, you may be very familiar with flexible work structures because increasingly you don't get guaranteed hours. You might just get called in on Saturday or not. Companies are increasingly relying on this flexible labor because then they don't have to pay workers who aren't really doing anything. But we can see how this might be bad for workers. All right, so everything looks different than this middle Keynesian period today. In Keynesianism, we have what we call a social contract. And this is named after John Maynard Keynes, a famous economist. And the idea was that if capitalism is going to work, then we need workers to be able to buy and to continue that consumption process. And so it's important for businesses and for the wealthy to give some of their wealth or redistribute it to social services for the poorer in society so that they have more money to buy and pay into these companies and keep the market churning. Since the 1970s, we've had a different set of ideas about the way things should work called neoliberalism. Liberalism is an ideology that the best thing is achieved, the best outcomes in society are achieved when people are freely pursuing their self-interest in the market. Competition is good for all. We'll dig into this a little bit more in our class period, but the idea here is that if companies are out there competing on the market, then they're going to make better products because they have more competition. As we've seen, that's not actually the case. There's less competition. And that if individuals like you and me are competing for jobs, we're going to work harder. And the people who are lazy and don't work hard, well, they're just not going to get as much. It works out for everyone. Yay! It doesn't work that way, but that's the idea behind it. And this has led to a series of policies since the 80s. We see less regulation of money and finance, so those companies that are coming together in a big way, that's because we're not regulating monopolies as much. Finance, we're not regulating credit. Those credit companies give you some really shifty deals, but we're not regulating. The government isn't stepping in and saying, hey, what are y'all doing as much. The Trump administration has been deregulating everything, environmental restrictions, everything you can think of. Again, this means that companies are free to do all this crazy stuff, and this is fed by this ideology of free markets, of free competition, of deregulation. And finally, it's non-redistributive, meaning that we don't have social programs and welfare. We don't redistribute wealth from the rich to the poor. Instead, we shift onto the poor costs and risks, the cost of retirement, the risks of retirement, the security in your job, all that goes away. It's a much more insecure system, and the workers are the ones who bear the risks, while companies, as we've seen through a number of bailouts recently, are actually pretty well cared for. Together, this takes the form of neoliberalism. It's a project that benefits one class, the capitalists, at the expense of the working class. We'll dig into this more in our discussion session.